class link. This is our second semester to offer business classes. They are branded Empower You Business, and they are meant to help improve business skills. These classes are held on Wednesday, and they cost $10 each. At the end of our program, there will be time for questions for those in attendance, as well as those virtual attendees. We ask you to please remember to wait for a microphone before asking your questions so our virtual guests can hear also. Empower You is a free university powered by donations. The costs incurred include website, constant contact, printing and advertising, virtual, some speaker and personnel expenses. To allow us to continue offering these classes, we always pass a bucket at the end of each class. We welcome your small donation and thank you for understanding the costs we try to cover. Please feel free to provide any comments or feedback on any sessions that you attend. We also value any input on ideas of topics or speakers you may have. You can reach us at info@empoweruohio.org. Thank you for attending tonight's session, and at this time, I am pleased to introduce Empower You's Director, Dan Reginald.
Welcome, everybody. I wanted to, at the risk of trying an experiment, they say never try an experiment that it might not work, right? I wanted to show you just how easy it was with our new online service to watch a class on your iPhone. You only need one thing to make it work, but it's so simple. I just tried it. It was amazing. If you just go to, what you have to do is you have to load a free app on your phone. It's called Click Meeting. That's all it is. It's free. It works on Android or it works on an iPhone. And then all you have to do is go to empoweruohio.org, our website, and go to the class. You'll see Greg's smiling picture right here. And then down towards the bottom, right above register, if you just click the link and you hit open and you hit join, let's see, and you hit video, and there you are. And it's as simple as that. So our previous service you couldn't use your telephone to watch, but now you can. So if you ever want to watch a class that's coming up, it's really, really simple. All you have to do is load that app. It really, really is a nice thing. So I wanted to tell you about a couple classes that are coming up and that I think are really, really going to be good. Tuesday. Right here at Empower You Studio, we're going to have a gentleman I know well, Brandon Sweinhardt, who was an Indian Hill kid. He grew up in Indian Hill, really the best of the best, and he moved out to San Francisco and became addicted to heroin. And for several years, he was really on the street living. He, by God's grace, was able to recover from that ordeal. He moved back to Cincinnati, started a great life, and has been clean for several years. He's going to talk to everybody and tell people about the story of how that happened and the promise of recovery that other people can have who are addicted to terrible drugs. It's a powerful story. I've heard part of it. I can't wait to hear the rest. So that's Tuesday night, right here from 7 to 8:30 p.m. On Wednesday, we're going to take Empower You on the road. We're going to be going to the Midway School, which is on Glenmore Avenue in Western Hills, for just what's going to be an incredible class, really a class that I feel like is really one of the most important topics of our time, and that is why the city of Cincinnati is a sanctuary city. And Greg is shaking his head back there, and I'm just taking the whole class from a standpoint. David Mann, many of you, I'm sure, have heard of David Mann. He's been around the city for years. Will be Rose is editorializing. He's going to be doing the class, and I just look forward to hearing his explanation of why he feels that that's the road the city should take, and and what it all means. And I know we're going to have lots of people down there because we've already had lots of people sign up, and I hope you'll join us. That's Andy. Andy, let's give Andy, our producer back there, a round of applause. Um, that's Andy and mine's chance to take the TV on the road, and hopefully everything will work, because I know a lot of people want to see the class. And then we've got 3 classes next week. We've got one other class, and that will be the Save Lives Faster class, which will be next Thursday, and that'll be kind of a different class from our active shooter class, where the person who's going to be coming in will be talking about a different perspective, Joe Eaton, on how to save lives if you ever had an active shooter in your building, what you could do or how you could do it differently. And I think that's going to be a great class too. So hope you join us for some of those fun classes coming up. So we've just got a little drawing here, and we've got a good chance to win. So grab your tickets for a gift card for bringing us up. And I'm going to ask, so let's see, 609. Who's got Dr. Morava? Let's get Morava. And then lastly, what a pleasure to ask our executive director, Nita Thomas, to come up to introduce our speaker. Nita, let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you, Dan, and thank all of you for attending tonight. And I would like to introduce our speaker, Greg Lawson. Greg is a senior policy analyst at the Buckeye Institute, who works with all members of the Buckeye research team with a particular focus on local government and education issues. He is also Buckeye's main liaison to the State House, where he educates policymakers in both the legislative and executive branches on free market solutions to Ohio's challenges. Greg also served in Ohio General Assembly as a legislative seeker? I think I mean service. It sounds more interesting though. He then went on to several government affairs roles, focusing on numerous public policy topics, including Medicaid, school choice, transportation funding, and Ohio's building code. He also has a background in PAC fundraising, grassroots organizing, and communications, and served for 5 years on the boards of 2 Columbus-based charter schools. Early in his career, Lawson yearly joined the U.S. Foreign Service. See, there's a connection. He continues to engage in his passion for foreign policy and history through participation in programs to strengthen ties between the United States and Turkey, travel, and his affiliation with the global internet-based geopolitical consultant organization. I would say he's one busy guy. Lawson lives in Westerville, Ohio with his wife and 3 children. So let's welcome Greg.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate it. Yeah, you know, I sometimes does feel like you're being monitored. You know, I'll tell you, it was kind of interesting. You know, is everybody aware of the WikiLeaks thing that happened the other day with the CIA and the Weeping Angel, which is the thing that apparently lets them you think you've turned off your Samsung TV, but it's apparently in false sleep mode according to WikiLeaks. And so what it actually does is it still manages to monitor you even when you think it's turned off. It's kind of apparently the CIA made it with the British. And the reason I bring all this up is I like foreign policy for one thing, like kind of a pet hobby of mine. But 2, I'm a fan of a British sci-fi show called Doctor Who. I grew up watching it as a kid. And one of the main villains in this new series is the Weeping Angel, which is why they named this CIA thing after that. So I thought it was hilarious at this show I woke up. Not good. Let me rephrase that. I thought it was hilarious that was the name they chose, not that the fact that the CIA is apparently hacking into our TV, or there's evidence now that it is. So it is concerning. But you know, I've been with the Buckeye Institute now for 6 years. 6 years in February. So we've done a lot of stuff over the years, and the Buckeye Institute's been around. Probably most of you know the Buckeye Institute. Is everybody kind of familiar with what the Buckeye Institute does? Or I see a few heads going yes and a couple saying no. So I'll do a quick overview that way, and then we'll kind of dive into some of the issues. We're a free market think tank. So what I kind of like to say in the shorthand is, does everybody know the Heritage Foundation in Washington? Okay. So we're kind of like an Ohio version of the Heritage Foundation. We believe that low taxes, less regulation are the kind of things that is going to allow the private sector to grow, and the best thing to be able to create opportunities for families here in Ohio to get jobs, and get better incomes, build the kind of community and life they want for their families. So again, the key thing is to keep government back. So we kind of focus on the state more than the federal government, although anymore, because of how powerful and large the federal government's gotten, it's impossible to ignore reach of the federal government. So we do have to work with that. And obviously, we also work with think tanks around the country, as well as groups like Heritage, Cato, and the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, in order to kind of find out what's going on in Washington and what's going to kind of come downhill, so to speak, on us as states. But in my background, because I've done some government affairs, previous jobs I've had prior to joining Buckeye, I sort of I did some politics, and then I did a number of kind of lobbying and policy-oriented things. And I realized that I really appreciated politics and policy. And I kind of came at it at first from the politics, but then I grew to appreciate the policy is really where my passion and interest was. So the opportunity to work at an organization with the pedigree of the Buckeye Institute, the history of our organization has been around since 1989, actually, and started in Dayton and moved to Columbus in the early 90s. Was really a great opportunity. So I do policy research on education and local government issues. I follow a lot of other policy areas as well, but those are more like those are my core issue areas. And then I do a lot of work with the legislature, as Nita mentioned. So I like to, and if I had known how cool this was, I should have actually created a PowerPoint. I apologize. I have handouts here. Hopefully everybody has a handout. But next time I do one of these, I think I'll have to put it up because this, this is a great setup. This is a wonderful room. So, but I like to put it into context. What is the story of Ohio? Why are free markets something that we really need to do? What are the kind of intense things that we need to do to improve Ohio? And I'll start off by asking, does anybody in this room think that Ohio's economy is really good? Any hands? Really bad? Any hands? Or just kind of muddling through? Okay. And in a certain sense, you're right. Ohio is muddling through if you look at the numbers. That's what the story of Ohio is right now. Now, interestingly enough, the story of Ohio, if you pull the lens back and look over time, is that Ohio is actually worse than muddling through. If you look at the last decade, 2000 to 2010, everybody suffered because, of course, we had the Great Recession in the late 2000s. But if you look at Ohio, we suffered a lot more than most states in the country. We lost more private sector jobs between 2000 and 2010, with probably about 400 or so, close to 400,000 of those jobs coming during the Great Recession itself. But we were already having a really hard time even before that. And I think that's a critical thing to understand is even in the first half of the decade, we were really struggling. But then the bottom really did fall out 2007, 2008. And we lost more private sector jobs than any state in the country except Michigan. We lost about 620,000 private sector jobs in that decade. Michigan lost a little over 700,000. So, we apparently can beat Michigan in more than one thing. We beat them all the time in football, and it's nice to know that we can beat them in jobs too. Unfortunately, the bad side of it is that Michigan's actually got a higher growth rate right now of jobs than we do. So they haven't recovered all the jobs that they lost because they did so badly, but they're actually growing at a faster rate than we are. So now they're actually beating us, unfortunately, in the race itself. The first document, or the first page here, and I started with this because the graph. What the graph shows is private sector employment going back to 1990. And so, and if you look, you can kind of see the oscillations there, but you can see when everything hit the fan, really, with the big dip there in terms of the massive job losses. And we've kind of recovered, but what you'll notice with our recovery, ever since we've come out, is that we're still actually, there's not really any peaks that measure up to even what we were doing in the 1990s, which was obviously the boom years of the 90s, and everybody remembers that. The problem with Ohio is that even in the good years, when we're growing, we're not growing at the national level. We also have a tendency to get into recessions earlier than other states, and we tend to stay in recessions longer and come out later. So all of these things play together. In fact, I like to say that the Cleveland Plain Dealer, not usually one of the best papers in the state, but occasionally they'll do some good stuff. They did a great piece about a year and a half ago that showed that in every term of a governor, for every 4 years of a governor, there's never been a governor who had job growth at the national level. It's going back 50 years. So they went back to before Jim Rowe. So it's 50 years that we have this story. 50 years of subpar growth, not at national level, and then we have the story of the bottom falling out under the subgrowth. So again, everybody suffered, but we suffered more. So what do we do about that? This is a systemic problem that Ohio has, and it transcends parties. I mean, we have governors of both parties in power over the long period of time. We didn't have an income tax back in the 60s. We developed that in the 70s. We didn't have public sector collective bargaining until the 1980s in Ohio, interestingly enough. So, there's obviously something that was already not right, but then you start adding these policies into the mix, and you can start to see that Ohio really has not managed to adapt into the new century. And while we are having job growth, the governor talks a lot about the job growth. He talks a lot about the Ohio Miracle, for example, during the presidential campaign. And it's true, we've grown, but we are still not growing at the national level. We're not even growing at the Indiana and Michigan rate. And I would submit that the big reason why is because we have not really embraced the kind of free market policy that will allow Ohio to excel. Now, the weather was pretty good today in Columbus. I think it's pretty nice up here. I hear it's going to get really cold again this weekend, so I'm not ready for. I've kind of gotten used to not the real March, the untrue March weather. We can't change, but I guess it's going to come back to the wintry blast. We can't change the weather. We can't be Florida. We can't do some of those things, but we can sure embrace better policy. We can make it more attractive for people to come here and for people to stay here and for our population to grow. One more negative thing before I try to get to a few more positive things is, in the 1960s, we had 24 congressional seats in the House, or U.S. House of Representatives. We have 16 now. We've lost 1/3 of the congressional representation. Again, there's that 50-year time period on the top of that. The reason that's important is because the number of seats that you get in the House is apportioned based upon your population. Not your absolute population, but your relative population to other states. So whereas we haven't actually lost absolute population, we've just been very stagnant in growth. Other states in the South, predominantly the South and West, are growing like gangbusters. It's not just Texas, although Texas has done remarkably well, but it's Arizona. It's even speaking of Utah, Wyoming. These are places that have populations that are, relatively speaking, growing pretty fast. And every state's different. Every state has different natural resources. Every state has different climates. So there's obviously going to be a difference there. But one thing most of these states also do have are better policies. They have better policies because many of them don't have income taxes. Many of them are right-to-work states. Many of them are better at restraining their budget growth on the growth of state government. And when you take and many of them are also really aggressive and kind of work really hard on regulation, trying to make sure that red tape doesn't gum up new business development. That's what Ohio needs to be embracing more. That's what our research tends to show. And that's what we talk a lot about when we go and speak to policymakers at the State House in Columbus is, let's kickstart this thing. Let's get this economy moving so that we can see peaks on these charts that are higher than we're seeing now. So that when the next recession hits, we're not the worst ones. We're not getting hit upside the head as hard. Biggest thing that you have going on in every 2 years is the state budget. The state budget is being debated now. So what I actually included in this packet is a series of blog posts that I wrote and several of my colleagues have written at the Buckeye Institute, kind of breaking apart different pieces of the budget. The budget is probably pretty boring for people who don't want to, be policy wonks and all that. But I'll tell you, it's the most important thing that the state government does every 2 years. Your tax policy, your education funding policy, how much money goes to the district, what we do about Medicaid, and the growth of the spending in the Medicaid program, how much money goes to the institutions of higher education, how much money goes to the Department of Rehabilitation Corrections, and how we manage our prison populations. All of that is contained in this one massive piece of legislation. So it is a lobbyist field day in Columbus, no question about that. They're all over the state house. And it's an interest group fiesta. And it's also an interesting time when you see a lot of normal people dressing up to Columbus to talk to legislators and telling them what they need. And frequently what you'll see is most of the time the people who make that trip to Columbus are asking for more money, more tax dollars to be spent in whatever particular pet. I use the word derisive when we do pet projects. I shouldn't always say that. It's not pet projects. Sometimes they're actually good causes, but the question becomes, can government afford it and should government be doing it? So we're in the throes of this right now. I'm spending a lot of my time at the State House and looking at what the governor's taxes are going to be. And we can kind of go into some of those details. For those of you that are interested, I'll open it up for some Q&A because I think that might be where we get some of our best dialogue on those things. In a nutshell, our view from the free market perspective is the budget is a very mixed bag that the governor proposed. Obviously, the final budget proposal for the final budget is going to look vastly different by the time it gets through the full two chambers. But in a nutshell, directionally speaking, the governor's trying to move in the right way on taxes, but I think he's mistiming some stuff and has some flaws and targeted some specific industries with tax increases that I think are very going to be harmful and are not fair and violate good sound tax policy, which should not be picking winners and losers by applying a tax only and specifically to particular businesses. There's not enough reform to Medicaid in the initial budget proposal. There needs to be a heck of a lot more done with that because that program is gobbling up massive amounts of resources, and the state might be on the hook for more of that because the federal government, who is the partner on Medicaid, is likely to spend less with the new administration in Washington and with the way the Congress is currently constructed as well with Republican majorities. So if those dollars aren't as free flowing, which they shouldn't be, because that Fed has to do with Medicaid, a big part of our deficit spending in Washington. But if they start basically turning the spigot off, we're going to have more money that we have to spend at the state level unless we reform this program dramatically. There's not enough of that in the budget, so that's the most opportunity. The governor is, we think, moving in a better direction on education funding. That's probably worth a whole topic in and of itself. Because education funding is extremely complicated when you look at how the state spends and have the interaction between state taxes and state spending and local revenues and how they make calculations and how they allocate that. We can talk about that if those that are interested. I'll be happy to go into that more. He's trying to make sure that the state funding formula is actually operating as it's designed by law to do. What we find is that legislators don't really want it to act that way because if it acts the way that it is designed, some districts will lose money when they lose students. And you might think that seems obvious. If you have less students enrolled, you probably should maybe not be getting as much money because you don't have the same level of cost. But in Columbus, that's not how many legislators see it. They think that you can't cut spending, no matter even if you lose 20% of your students. You must at least be held harmless. I'm not joking. That's what they do. So Kasich is actually trying to shift away from that. So we think that's at least a small step in the right direction. So you look at all of this, and what you see is an extraordinarily mixed bag. In my view, it could be a whole heck of a lot worse of a budget, but it's not going to be. We don't have the massive tax reform we need. We don't have labor reform, which is a really big issue in this state. And some of the steps that we are taking that are even in the right direction continue to be very small steps that aren't getting our spending in line. We're still spending more. We're spending we're spending basically over the course of 2 fiscal years, when you look at all the money that's being spent, which includes state dollars and federal dollars, $144 billion. And so it's over $70 billion in each fiscal year, which begins on the 1st of July. So, and there's not really a sign of slowing this stuff down that much, especially Medicaid. So we really have to be aggressive. So what would an aggressive policy look like? What would an aggressive free market policy look like? Well, for one thing, we need to get more serious about the income tax. Sales taxes and consumption taxes are better taxes for growth. They're better taxes for growth because what income taxes and corporate taxes do is they disincentivize investment. And investment is how you need money to go into businesses so that you can create opportunities and create jobs. And if you're taxing that, you're disincentivizing it at some level. Now, it depends on how much you tax it and what you do. I mean, there's a lot of variability in that. Of course, progressives want you to tax at very high rate successful people because they think successful people should bear the burden of taxation because that's fair in their mind. Obviously, the more conservative free market perspective is that's not right. That's actually the inverse of what you want to do because that snuffs out growth. That means that you're at best redistributing a pre-existing economic pie rather than trying to actually grow the pie, make it bigger so everybody can be more successful. So we need to do more on moving the income tax, getting rid of the income tax. We've seen a lot of income tax reductions since Governor Taft was in office. Strickland put a stop to it for a while, and in cases just put the pedal to the metal on it. In terms of finishing up income taxes were supposed to have been phased in from the Taft era, and also continuing to do other tax cuts. And has done actually some small business tax cuts in particular that are designed to be really helpful for the small business owners to try to get them to be able to invest more, keep more of their money, perhaps start hiring more people, because small businesses, when you look at a lot of academic literature, are actually the major engine of economic job growth. Big businesses now tend to be, and this isn't meant to be pejorative, but big businesses tend to be net job destroyers. What I mean by that is, that's actually, let me rephrase that, not destroyers, but they don't create net jobs because what happens is they usually become more efficient, they technologize, they do things like that to do more with less. The new jobs that pick up a lot of people that get laid off, the bigger jobs, are the fresh jobs, the new jobs, the people with a new product, a new service, a niche perhaps that they are meeting that the big guys aren't focusing on because they're focusing on the big ticket stuff. You don't get a lot of jobs with a new, necessarily a new small business, but when you aggregate up all of these over the nature of the entire economy, that's where you see the long-term growth. Unfortunately, it's a problem in Ohio and a problem in the country since the recession. We're seeing much smaller numbers of new businesses. Ohio's seeing a little bit of there's been a few, last couple of years have actually been a little bit better in terms of people filing paperwork to start new businesses. But overall, Ohio has not been as good with entrepreneurship and the smaller businesses. And when you look at new startups from a national perspective, they're starting off at a much lower rate than they were prior to this. So we need to keep this tax policy in mind because this is going to be not the only thing, but it is a key thing to help make it easier for the new guys to get off the ground. Second thing we have to do is we have to look at regulation. Does everybody know what right to work is in Ohio, or what right to work is in the policy? So we, up until back 5 years ago, basically, no states in the Midwest were right to work, which basically only means, right, that union, it's not a closed union shop. If you go to a place that's already unionized, you can join the union if you want to, but you don't have to join the union. But if you're not a right to work state, you do have to join the union, or you have to pay agency fees, which are the cost supposedly of their collective bargaining on your behalf, because they're your exclusive bargaining unit. They will bargain for your wages, whether you want to be part of the union or not. They actually fight so that you can't not be part of the bargaining unit, because they want everybody in the bargaining unit so that you still have to pay your quote unquote what they call fair share dues. So it's a very restrictive thing. And it also makes unions not as responsive as they could be to their own membership. So a lot of states have said, no, we're not going to do that. federal law that deals with labor issues and there's an ability for states to opt out of essentially the National Labor Relations Act. And that's what right to work is the ability to opt out and say, no, if a person doesn't want to be in the union, they don't have to be in the union, and they don't have to pay the fair share piece because they're not wanting to be a part of that bargaining unit. In the Midwest, most of the time, most southern states and a good chunk of western states have been right to work for many, many years. But the entire Midwest has essentially been not right to work, not workplace, what we call workplace freedom, workplace fairness, whatever you want to call it. It's a closed shop situation. But beginning in 2000, I believe in early 2012, it could have been the end of 11, no, early 2012, Indiana went right to work. Then, let's see, 2000 and it was either at the end of 13 or the very beginning of 14, Michigan, of all states, went right to work. A couple of years ago, West Virginia did. This January, Kentucky went right to work. So what we now see is that of our 5 contiguous neighboring states, 4 of 5 of them have gone right to work in the last 5 years. The only state that has not is Pennsylvania. This is an issue that now is almost like Voldemort state legislators. It's the word that cannot be spoken at the state level. The governor doesn't want to talk about it. Legislative leaders, even though I think most of them are philosophically inclined to be supportive of it, are afraid to embrace this. And the bad thing is, we are now losing opportunity. Instead of being a first mover to make ourselves more attractive and a safer, more free type of state, we at best are going to be a laggard now, if not the absolute laggard. I mean, heaven help us if Pennsylvania manages to figure out. I'm not sure if that happened. Let's say Pennsylvania does it now before we do, which is at least conceivable. We are again proving ourselves to be unable, just like we aren't able to move away from the income tax as fast as we need to. We're not embracing the income tax. And we're letting our neighbors do it. And our neighbors were already late to the game, like I said, with all the other states and other regions. So again, this is another missed opportunity for the state of Ohio. We also have a lot of things we've tried to address, regulations and red tape, but we still think there's more that we can do fast. We need to, the governor's done some good things on trying to make it a little bit easier for businesses to navigate state agencies and how state agencies draw up the rules. But one big thing that all states have a problem with is what's called occupational licensing. And interestingly enough, we all think doctors should be licensed, probably, right? And now, maybe some disagreement. Some people might not agree with that, but most people say doctors and dentists, nurses should be licensed. But should auctioneers no longer be licensed? They are. Should people who want to do HVAC, air conditioning and stuff, should they have about 2.5, 3 times the number of hours that they have to do apprentice work before they can get a full-blown license and actually work on their own and do their own thing? Should they have 2 or 3 times the amount of license that most other states have before they can do that on their own? They do in Ohio. Should Ohio have a cosmetology manager's license that is an extra 300 hours that you get to just run an office, even if the owner of the salon wants you to be the manager, and you've got a full-blown cosmetology license, you've already got that, but you can't be a manager without a special manager's license. Ohio did that until last year and was the only state in the whole country that did that. So these are the kind of examples of what I would characterize as light occupational licenses that are burdensome, add hours, add more costs first and foremost to folks. And a lot of times these costs hit middle to lower and lower income people much harder and make it harder for them to get their job, to get in their job quickly and moving and doing stuff. We think we need to do a lot more with that so we can get people hired quicker and people maybe can start their own businesses more quickly. We want everybody to be safe, so we're not going to say it again. We want to be very clear. We're not saying that every doctor is going to go out there and not do anything, but those weren't physicians we were talking about. We need to be able to recalibrate those kind of regulatory policies to improve things as well. So taxes, labor, regulation. We've got to do all of those things. And I should also clarify, I kind of glided over this, but we have to also get a grip with our spending. If we don't contain Medicaid in particular, and if we constantly think that the only answer to education and education outcomes is to just spend perpetually more money, our budget's going to keep on growing. I mean, again, $144 billion over the next 2 years in the governor's budget, and it probably won't get that much smaller by the time the legislature does it. It'll shift around, spending will shift. It'll be in slightly different areas, but it's hard for me to envision that it's going to be that much smaller by the time the legislature gets done with it. So next time, you know what it'll probably be? It'll be at least another probably 5 or 6% above that the next few times. So that'll be another. We'll be looking at probably at least 150 to 155 billion in the next 2 years after this. Then 160, 170. And that's if you don't see wholesale big changes, you know, a new governor will get elected. We don't know who that person might be. There's a lot of people running for the Republican side. There's at least one announced Democrat running right now. They're going to have spending things they're going to want to put money into. When do we get a grip? And the worst thing is, the more we spend today, when our economy is at least marginally better, means you're always setting a higher budget baseline, which means that when you hit a recession and you don't have the money coming in, what do you have to do? Cut spending dramatically and not judiciously. Instead of using a scalpel, you're using a meat cleaver. Or the other thing you can do is raise taxes, which, if we've been working to lower taxes to make us more competitive, is the reverse of what we want to be doing. So again, spending this way is critical. You're not going to be able to perpetuate tax reform if you can't get a grip on those things. So we have a book that we call the Piglet book because of Fort Merrill and spending money unwisely and stuff like that. We do this now every budget cycle, and so this will probably be coming out in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And so there's specific areas of budget that we suggest should be eliminated. That's not necessary, not stuff the government needs to be doing. For example, who likes wine? You know that 5 cents of your gallon, 5 cents per gallon tax on your wine. You know, some of that goes to a marketing fund to market Ohio wine. You're paying a tax on whatever wine you buy, and that money is going to market only certain wines. Now, can't the Ohio wineries, especially if they have good product, and by the way, I'm not trying to say anything bad about Ohio wine, especially if anybody here likes Ohio wine. But shouldn't they be able to fund that on their own marketing campaign? Do they need tax dollars from somebody who's buying an Italian wine or French wine or a California wine to do it? But they are. You know, tourism is a really good thing. We like Ohio. We want people to come to Ohio and do fun stuff. Kings Island down here, Cedar Point up north, the zoo, fun stuff here. $10 million each fiscal year, so $20 million over the next 2 years is going to be set aside in appropriation out of sales tax revenue for Tourism Ohio, the Department of Developmental Services, to advertise Ohio. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with advertising certain things. You know, companies and locations, hotels and conference centers, fun stuff, and destinations are completely and should market as well. But should the state be involved in this? Should the state be investing in specific companies and giving grants and loans to individual businesses? Should they be picking winners and losers? What we call it, because if you give a loan or a subscription or grant to one business, what happens to the businesses that don't get it from you? Why didn't they get it from you? And yet the government does all of these things all the time. What about, does anybody like art? I think probably a little bit, because we're in a really nice location with a lot of friends. I actually have, I need to get framed. I might get your card, because actually I'll probably be back down in Cincinnati sometime, and I like this place. So, but art is a great thing. Art museums are great. But why are we spending why do we appropriate $14 million to the thing called the Ohio Arts Council to give direct grants to purchase art for museums and things like that? Why can't they do private philanthropy to raise money to do that? Now, I mean, that $14 million is not a lot when we look at $144 million overall budget, right? Every million here, blah, 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 10 million here, 14 million, starts to add up. We have that kind of stuff all over the place. If we could pare some of that back, we could get more realistic in our budget too, and focus again on the core things that the state needs. Oh, one other thing we do need to do, another policy area that I should have mentioned, the rehabilitation corrections, prisons. We have a really high prison population. We actually, my understanding is, in percentage terms and ratio of prisoners to workers in prisons, we are at about early 90s. Lucas, we're actually ahead, I think, in the ratio of where we were when Lucas was at. So we have a real problem. And the real interesting thing about that, the tragic thing about that, is a lot of people that are in DRC in prisons are there for very short periods of time. They're there for drug use offenses. This isn't all the murderers and rapists and bad people that we think of. There's many people that are not violent criminals that are in there taking up space and spending a lot of money. So we think there's a series of, and we have a criminal justice fellow actually on staff. Buckeye Institute has been doing a lot of work to look at what are responsible ways of alleviating some of this, so that the prisons that we have, we don't have to. First of all, we don't have to build another prison because over $1 billion of spending right there if we had to build another prison. And what can we do to alleviate some of this and to move people who may need some treatment, especially some of the drug problems? I mean, we're obviously going to be hearing what sounds like it's going to be a compelling story in the next week or so about somebody who suffered from addiction. There's a lot of people who are addicted who get into the prison system. Should they be in the prison system? Should we be spending money there? Do we need to be spending money somewhere in the community to get people off so that they don't become recidivism, don't have recidivism and go back, and all of these things? So we need some more innovative policies there, and we need some more innovative policies with parole and bail and a whole bunch of different issues there, because we have a really fragmented system of how we manage our populations who are in, even outside of just the prisons, but the people who need to be monitored, but we don't do a particularly good job of that because of local conflicts with how local governments operate and things like that. We've got to address that too, or we're going to be building our prison. We're having to hire a lot more staff. That's another budget expense and some moral things. We obviously come out from a fiscal standpoint, but there is a question as to whether or not that you want to put certain people away. I mean, there's some people that need to be put away, and then there's some people that shouldn't be. We also then need to be careful about what we do with these people with licensing and getting jobs when they get out, because if they get out of prison and they can't get a job, that's a problem. So we've got to be able to try to deal with certain what they call collateral sanctions, which are sanctions that are levied upon people who have a criminal record. You got to be careful. You can't, you don't want the sex offender working necessarily in a school or a nursing home or something like that. I mean, there's obviously things you got to be smart about and careful about. But you do need to find ways to get people gainfully employed, or they're going to maybe go back into the system. So we've got to do that, because the prison system is the third biggest budget item. Medicaid is, I believe, number one now when you factor in federal. It's when you factor in both state and federal, I think Medicaid is now number one. If you look at just state dollars, K through 12 education is number one, and then DRC is number three. So we've got to deal with that too. So that is sort of a 30,000-foot view. There's a lot of very specific things that we can talk about, and I think now, instead of rambling on more on that, I'd probably like to open it up to some questions and to see, what you guys are thinking about things and where we can improve things and what people are currently doing to state.
Can I ask a question first, Greg? So I know the governor has this fascination with sales taxes, and that's kind of the newest thing that he's proposing. I hate sales taxes myself, but is it just because of the reason you mentioned that the income tax is a sales tax helps get more investment in as opposed to an income tax?
Yes, basically, that is what the governor believes. That's what his budget director believes. And when you hear the budget director testify before the legislature, that's what he talks about all the time. Here's one of the things I will say. We are generally supportive of the sales tax more in lieu of the income tax. We do have, that's why I say that directionally we like where the governor is going, but timing and the specifics are problematic. And what I mean by this is, By the time we get through this whole budget that we have right here, the governor got his whole budget through with all the tax changes. He has some big income tax cuts. He's got a 0.5% sales tax increase in the budget and an expansion of sales tax to a limited set of services, lobbying, I think cosmetic surgery, travel guides, a couple of others. They tried to make them think they thought they might be able to get through. So the problem though is that it's a net cut. In fact, all these things in of only $30 million over both this year. So we're moving things around all over kind of like the deck chairs on a Titanic. We're getting a $39 million net cut. We need to restrain the spending over time, get a bigger cut on the income tax. And if we have to have a conversation about the sales tax as a way to do what I would call a kill shot to the income tax, then we can have, I think, that might be a conversation we would be more open to. I think that doing all of that right now, when we're only going to be flattening some income tax brackets and lowering the top rate from 4.9 to 4.3%, which is what the budget proposal is, I'm not sure that that's the right sequence of that.
Could you say it first?
Does that answer your question?
Last question. At what point
Well, this actually gets to one of the interesting problems of Ohio, which is the interrelationship between local and state, because we have piggyback sales taxes. Cuyahoga County is like, God, I don't know, they're close to 9% now, or we're like 7.75, or they're 8%. We're 7.75 in Franklin County. What's your sales tax in Hamilton? You're 7. Okay, so you're still low. Although I guess you're paying for the Bengals stadium a little bit still, I hear, right? Unfortunately, but I don't want to say exactly. I will say we have to look at the surrounding areas too. This is another thing. If you are going to talk about sales tax, you got to look at the sales tax of your neighboring state, because when you talk about border communities, like here, where you can go maybe to Kentucky or Indiana or something like that, that's a serious issue. So I think that we would want to be very careful. We're getting up there in the sales tax right now. I think my thinking would be another 0.5% with maybe some sales tax expansion on certain services and an elimination of the income tax. That might still be within the wheelhouse. And if we start going like, oh, we're going to add another % to it, and then you have the piggyback, now we're really starting to talk some problems, I think.
Yes, I know that my name is Rose, and I know there's, as an incentive, the feds, as a part of Obamacare, offered money to the states so they would expand Medicaid. And but there was a cutoff point, and I believe the cutoff point is 2017. And how will that affect Medicaid in Ohio?
Well, what they did is
Budget.
what they did is they gave 100% funding for what they call the expansion population, which are basically employable adults who don't have kids, they're not the disabled age. Those are folks who are already in the Medicaid system. They gave 100% for the first couple of years, and then they started ratcheting down. We're now at 90. Beginning this year, I think it's 95%. So now the state has to take up 5% of the cost of the expansion population out of state resources. And it's eventually by, I think, 2020. I could have my years wrong, but by 2020, it's supposed to be 90%. So it's still an enhanced match. So the pre-existing Medicaid program prior to the expansion, we got like something like 57, 68% from the feds, and then we pick it up. So that's when you think of like nursing homes, home care, disabled children, and community stuff. All of those kind of things were already in Medicaid. And pregnant women was in Medicaid as well. So there were some select groups that were there, obviously. They got 68% match. So even under current law, under Obamacare, it's supposed to be 90%. In theory, forever. However, there could be a lot of changes in Washington, and we're already seeing some of them. There's already a lot of time. The governor's actually gone to Washington to lobby President Trump and to lobby Congress not to fundamentally change Medicaid, because he doesn't want to lose that funding. because what they're talking about in Washington is block granting Medicaid as opposed to having it operate the way they currently does. Which, to pull it back a little bit on Medicaid, think about this, how this operates. It's an open-ended spending program. The state is incentivized to spend more state dollars because it draws down more federal dollars. And there's no limit, in theory, to what it can draw down. So you have all kinds of little gimmicks that the state puts together to draw down federal dollars. They had for example, they had a sales tax on managed care plans that were Medicaid managed care plans, not just any managed care plan, but Medicaid HMOs. They put a sales tax only on them. They drew down more federal dollars, and then they reimbursed the Medicaid managed care plans on the backside. So what they ended up doing is taxing tax dollars to get more tax dollars. But, I mean, literally, that's what they were doing. And so, but they were incentivized to do that. And the feds had no real, I mean, they actually said eventually you can't do that. And so we created it. There's another way of fixing that, but there's a budget proposal on that and all. But the funny thing is, it's open-ended. When you say, we want me to cut Medicaid, you know what happens? All the providers, the hospitals, the doctors, the nurses, all the patients, interest groups for the developmentally disabled and folks like that. People would, I mean, you know, there's some pretty powerful stories actually that come up. But like, you can't cut this because if you cut it, you're not just cutting that $1. No. You're going to lose $3. And technically, you're right. Because you're going to lose those $2 federal dollars. That's how pernicious Medicaid is. Kind of that Faustian bargain. So the block grant that the Republicans in Congress are trying to shift to would essentially, and there's a number of ways they can do it, but it would limit that. It would kind of cap that so that it's not this open-ended funding story. So that the states only get a certain amount and then they figure out what they want to do with it. But they can't just keep coming up with creative ways to pull more money out of Washington.
Questions? Right here.
I am Joe, and I have two questions. One is the state legislator sort of skittish about right to work because of the Senate bill or whatever the one that didn't pass? And if so, how can they get around it and tweak it so that it could pass? And number two is, seems like there's, whether you have income tax or you have real estate tax or you have sales tax, there's a certain amount of money that comes out. How is Ohio as far as the percentage of income of our income goes to state and local taxes compared with, say, Illinois or Indiana or those places?
On the first question, the answer is yes. Senate Bill 5 definitely made legislative change. There's actually another ghost that even goes back further. There's the ghost of the 1950s when there was actually a right to work ballot issue that went down and claiming defeat, and a bunch of Republicans lost their office. Everything else, there's a bunch of big freak out about that in Senate Bill 5. Fortunately, some of this freak out on Senate Bill 5 is a little problematic because, interestingly enough, not a single legislator lost their re-election over the vote on Senate Bill 5, except I believe one lost who was a no vote. Really. So, and they've actually gained. And right now, they have more House seats than any party's ever had since they went to 99 House seats. So they are scared of it, but I think that there's some demonstrable evidence from election outcomes that should make them be a little bit less scared. But look, legislators are always nervous about politics. They're nervous about having people pick at their houses. They're nervous about the bad things they're going to say about them in the press. And, you know, there's always good legislators who don't care and do the right thing no matter what. And then there's always going to be a lot of folks who don't want it. That's not what they signed up for. The other problem in Ohio is we actually have the referendum question. Legislators believe, and actually they're not totally wrong to believe this, if they pass right to work, the union will gather signatures and make it a referendum. And when they do that, right to work doesn't go into effect until the outcome of the ballot. That's what happened with Senate Bill 5. So contrast that, interestingly enough, with the state of Wisconsin. Governor Scott Walker did a pretty substantial collective bargaining reform in Wisconsin. Now, there were some differences. He exempted, for example, police and firefighters, which is a pretty big deal. But what was interesting was they couldn't stop that law from going into effect. Now, in Wisconsin, they actually had recall elections. They tried to recall Walker, and they failed. But we don't have recalls in Ohio. But what Walker had that was embedded was because they couldn't prevent that law from going into effect, they were able to then run on the cost savings that that reform helped them to achieve. In Ohio, we couldn't have done that. The legislature couldn't do it because it was stopped right away. And then when November happened and it lost 2-1, um, there was nothing to show for. There was no savings. So the problem is that they're scared not only of the SB5 thing, but they're scared of the referendum just in general. Because, I mean, and they're scared of that in some other policy areas too, I might add. Because aside from Senate Bill 5, there was a change to workers' comp in the 90s and Voinovich was governor. And Iowa put it on to help get the money, but they didn't put it on the ballot, and they lost that too. So legislators are basically like, why the heck do I want to take a hard vote, deal with all the crap I'm going to deal with? I got to stick it on the ballot anyway. Let somebody stick it on the ballot and pass it that way, and then we don't have to deal with it because it's going to have to go there anyway. It's not a real profile of courage. Do it that way, but that's what they're thinking. That's their calculus. And I think one of the things we probably have to see to get around that, to answer the second part of that question, is we got to see a lot of public support. I think we have to see some momentum develop, which actually ties to a very interesting local issue that's going on. Are you all familiar with Westchester Township? You're all familiar with a potential effort to potentially try to go right to work at the local level? Okay. This could be an interesting thing. And actually, they can do this because let me clarify. They can only do it for public sector. I mean, sorry, private sector, because the public sector has the collective bargaining law, so it conflict. So they can't do that. But under the federal law, that's the Controlling National Labor Relations Act. Long story short, the courts, 6 district courts, determined because of what was going on in Kentucky, because they were doing it at the local level in Kentucky, that there wasn't that absent a specific state prohibition, there's no federal prohibition on being able to do it at the local level. So Kentucky did a whole bunch of counties at the local level. And so in this case, there's nothing that says you can't do it at the local level here in Ohio if you have home rule. And most cities have home rule. And a few townships, Westchester is actually kind of unique because it has to be a home rule township, which has to have a special statutory designation. They had to go through a special process to get that, and there's actually not that many townships throughout the state that actually can do it, and probably 2/3 of them in Southwest Ohio. But that could be if that were to happen, and my understanding is that it could come back up. I don't think that issue is dead. And if other cities started doing this throughout the state and started seeing a bunch of people doing it at the local level, then I could see that there could be some momentum that the legislature might say, well, maybe we should do something like this. It's happening. And it's happening right here, and people are voting for it. Even then, I'm not sure that it would totally work because there's a lot of pushback and fear that'll be there. But I think that that's a legitimate pathway that it could take. Whether it will or not, I don't know. I mean, I'm not 100% sure if Westchester is going to do it. And I'm not sure that if they did it, if it's going to happen anywhere else. And I don't think if Westchester did it, that would be enough. It would have to be more. But we'll see what happens. And I believe the second question you asked was regarding taxes and how we compare. We actually, if you look at our total burden, and forgive me, I don't have it right off the top of my head, but actually there's a pretty good, if you go to the Ohio Department of Taxation website, they have a tax data series. If anybody's interested, I can give you my card, or you can go and you can give me a call, and I can direct you to it or send it to you actually. But they do a study where they look at per capita and percentage of income, how we rank our burden, and rank us according to the various states. And they do it both state and local, and then they look at state, and then they look at local, segment it out. And when you look at it from a per capita basis, the total burden, we're middle of the pack. We're in the mid to upper 20s%. We look at it as a percentage of income, we start getting a little bit higher. And what's really interesting is we're actually, as a percentage of income, we're actually really low now on state tax level. But we're actually higher as a percentage locally. So essentially, actually, local government, our burden, relatively speaking, when you look at how it's distributed in other states, is higher locally than it actually is to state. The percentage, I mean, you still pay more to the state, probably, when you pay to the local. But when you look at it in terms of the distribution, you actually pay a little bit more at the local level. And that's because of the piggyback sales tax, the property taxes. We also have a lot of direct access to the ballot. Like everybody can go to the ballot, and you know, you've got libraries, you've got that can have separate ballot issues. Obviously, the schools, you know, separate operating levies for police, separate operating levies for fire. Some places have zoo levies, you know, so you've got a lot of different things there. The other thing that is a real interesting question, which I didn't talk about earlier in my speech, but I think is important in the overall tax discussion, is the municipal income tax. Ohio is one of only 10 states that has a municipal income tax. And we have the second most number of jurisdictions that levy a municipal income tax. Pennsylvania has something like 2,000. We have about 600. And we, I believe, are the only state where you can be taxed both where you work and where you live. And because usually it's either a community tax or a residence tax. In Ohio, it could be both. Now, you could be lucky and you could get a credit, you know, for where you work. So if you work in Cincinnati and you live in Blue Ash, I don't know what the credit is. Hopefully it's 100%, but it might not be. I'm lucky because I work in Columbus and live in Westerville. I get 100% credit in Westerville, although I think it's absurd that I pay income tax to the place I work at for 8 hours a day instead of income tax to the place where my property is. I just always thought that was strange. But you can be double taxed with the municipal income tax if you don't get that credit, or you don't get 100% credit. No other state does it like that. No other state. It's a very complicated, cumbersome tax. And actually, one of the big budget items is some discussions about how is the state going to collect municipal income tax to simplify it for businesses, because what you'll see is businesses have to file W-2s and tax papers in multiple jurisdictions where they do work. And it's really rough for contractors because they may do business in a different jurisdictions. So they have to file every jurisdiction in the business in, even if the tax liability is relatively small. And we've heard stories anecdotally of contractors who actually have to prepare tax returns where they spend more money preparing the return than they actually owe in actual liability to the jurisdiction. So the local tax structure and the burden is a bit of a problem, and we're higher than the average now. That was a very long answer there, but it opened up a couple of other businesses. So yeah.
So my name is Zach with the AFP. I'd be curious to hear your take on the new healthcare, but particularly as it relates to how it will affect us Ohioans, or is it too early to tell in this version that's just being released?
Well, I don't think it's a very good bill. I don't think it's a very good bill. This is actually, unfortunately, becoming more of a political question, maybe a little bit of your policy question, because the problem is actually how do you get 51 votes to do the reconciliation? This is really inside baseball with how Congress operates. So, to make it long story short, if they tried to do everything they would want to do in one bill, they'd have to get 60 votes in the Senate. They could pass whatever they want to in the House, but they can't get 60 votes in the U.S. Senate. They couldn't get it through. So what they're doing is there's certain types of provisions that they only need 51 votes for. Taxing provisions and budget provisions, there's a parliamentary procedure called reconciliation that they can use where they don't need, where they can only use a majority, a simple majority to pass it. So that's what this bill essentially is crafted for, is crafted so they can get out of the House and they can get the 51 votes in the Senate because it's got tax and budget provisions in it. Unfortunately, what it doesn't have is regulatory provisions. And some of the regulatory provisions are the things that are actually the most problematic for insurance. There's a lot of problems. I mean, there's the taxing. The mandate is theoretically gotten rid of in this bill. There's There's a provision in there that if you don't keep insurance, that let's say you're a young person who's really healthy one day, you don't want to have insurance. Right now, there's a mandate you're supposed to do it, you have to pay a penalty. Well, under the bill that's in Washington right now, you wouldn't have to buy it. There's no penalty per se for not purchasing insurance. But then let's say you get canceled, and now you go and want to say, oh, I don't get insurance. Well, now they would allow the insurance to jack up your premium by 30%. So it's basically a penalty on you for doing that. Now, the reason they're doing that is so that you don't have people basically gaming the system. Because if everybody who got sick was bought insurance and got sick, the insurers would be spending a heck of a lot more money on those people. So there's a lot of complexity with how you have to do it to make the insurance market work. But to make a long story short, it's problematic because there's tax credit issues. There is that question of whether or not that is still sort of a mandate. It's not exactly, but it sort of is. And so there's a lot of consternation amongst a lot of groups about that. I can't think of a single major conservative group in Washington that's actually endorsing it. Heritage Action is not has come out against it. I think AFP National has come out against it. I think Freedom Works has come out against it. The problem, though, is purely political. If they can't get this through the Senate, and they're losing moderate Republicans already, if they go to a more conservative bill, I don't know if they have the votes to get that through the Senate. So I think the bill is deeply flawed, and because it doesn't address some of these regulatory questions, it's not going to do everything it needs to do. It's certainly not a full repeal. It's a partial repeal. It definitely repeals certain things, but it's a partial, not a full. And so it's a very bitter pill to take. I think the question that's going to be asked is, what's the political alternative? If they don't get if they can't get the votes, if this isn't packed, if it doesn't go through, then it's very possible they can't get anything through, and there won't be any repeal at all. And I think that's the question: is what happens if this bill fails? Is it likely that you're just going to get no repeal and Obamacare stands? I think that's the question. So I don't really like it. I don't like it at all. I think this is a question of politics more than policy, because I think it's not great policy. I think it's marginally. I think it's better than the current status quo, but it's not. It's certainly not what people want. Certainly from the free market perspective. But the politics and the parliamentary type creates a real problem for how to get it through. So Buckeye doesn't really have a position. We don't take a position on legislation specifically. On a personal level, I'm really conflicted on it because of those two reasons, but I'm not exactly sure yet how I feel about it. I get where Congressman Jordan's not for it, Rand Paul's not for it, and also I take what they say pretty seriously. On the other hand, I'm very nervous that we're not going to get anything.
Rose again. On that, on the proposal, the Ryan proposal. And I think the administration is backing it. I noticed Vice President Pence is going around on a tour. Like, I think part of it was when he came here, visited us, he started his tour. Because they look upon it as a three-tier type of thing.
Yeah.
It's not just this bill.
They know they have to deal with the regulations. The real, to be blunt about it, the problem is the other reconciliation item, which really gets to issues of how they do underwriting for insurance. They have certain guaranteed issue and community rating, which is certain limits that you have in terms of who you have to cover and how you have to cover it. This actually creates some real problems for underwriting the insurance policy because of how it deals with the risk management of the populations that the insurer has to cover. They need to address that to really address premium problem. There's a little bit you can do with some health, the essential, what they call the essential health benefits, which are the different types of things that each type of insurance plan must cover by mandate. There's a little bit of stuff that we might be able to do through waivers and things like that. But the underwriting stuff, which is really the stuff that's driving a big chunk of premium spiking, is stuff that they would have to do in a subsequent piece of legislation. And I think there's no question that they're going to introduce that. I don't really know. I personally would actually like to see them say, let's do one big package, let's do the reconciliation, and let's sue us and talk about that, and let's do that. Because if you have to say that we have to get 60 votes I don't know how the heck you're going to get rid of those regulations. I just don't know how you're going to get 60 votes. I mean, you don't have 60 Republicans. How are you going to get 8 Democrats to vote? You might be able to get like a couple of Democrats who are in Trump states who are up for re-election, and they have a lot of them up for re-election next year, by the way. They have many more than Republicans do in the next election cycle. But their activist base is calling for them to stop everything. How many of them are going to? I mean, maybe you can pick a couple of them off. You might be able to pick a guy in West Virginia off, or something like that. But how many of those guys are going to really pick off to get 60 votes? And the truth is, there's a couple of moderate Republicans, like ladies in Maine, tend to be pretty moderate and don't always vote the way that conservatives would like. How are you going to keep them on the reservation? I think they need to just go kind of big and bold. I'm afraid they won't do that, and I think the problem is we're going to end up with a bit of a Frankenstein. We're going to end up with probably one of two things. They ran it through. You're going to get a Frankenstein that's perhaps marginally better, but not tremendously better. And now the Republicans will own it, which is bad. Or they're not going to get anything done, and you're going to have Obama cool. That unless they want to really try something aggressive on that front. I mean, the Trump administration can do some regulatory relief through executive orders and stuff, but the issues on how they have to underwrite is statutory. And if even they try to do some relief, that's guaranteed litigation. And even with Gorsuch hopefully being put on the Supreme Court, I don't know that the Supreme Court would. I mean, the statute is what the statute is. And the Supreme Court can't change or shouldn't change it, or has a few times, but it shouldn't be changing the letter of the law. I think there's a gentleman here who's had his hand up a couple of.
Thank you. My name is Dave. I imagine you at the Buckeye Institute, you hear from large businesses in Ohio quite frequently about how policy impacts their business. How do you keep in touch with the smaller and medium-sized businesses? And because they're probably less likely to be reaching out to you, how do you reach out to them to understand their needs?
Couple of ways. One of the things is, since we're right across the State House, we're close to all the trade associations. And, if you're over at the State House, you see the people that represent the trade associations at the State House all the time. So we have interaction, and we kind of get that from either in-house lobbyists for specific companies or like the Ohio Chamber of Commerce. I'll tell you, one good group is NFIB. Their staff, I mean, they're an association, but they do represent the smaller guys. And to be candid, their views almost always align with our views. The Ohio Chamber of Commerce, nothing against them. I think they do good stuff. But what's interesting about them is they have people in all. So it's hard for them to come to a consensus view sometimes on controversial issues because, they have big hospitals who want to medical care, but they probably have some businesses who didn't want medical care. They have some people who are utilities who want re-regulation of the utility market. And they have a lot of people who use electric and don't want electric prices to go up, so they're not for it. So they have a hard time coming to consensus position. FIB, though, for the most part, they're pretty good. Their staff is good, in my experience, and they do a pretty good job of surveying the membership. So, I mean, we stay in touch with NFIB on a pretty regular basis, quite frankly, their staff. And I think, too, another thing that we try to do, I mean, we have a number of NFIB individual members that also contribute to the Buckeye Institute. And also, I mean, to the extent that we have those relationships with the donors, who tend to be some of the smaller business folks, we take what they say extremely seriously. I know our president, Robert Allen, who actually came with the Heritage Foundation, it does a lot of going around the state talking to folks in that. I mean, it's not perfect or scientific, but I mean, we do talk to a lot of those kind of businesses with those contacts and those conversations. Now, actually, you bring up a point that, we've been growing a little bit lately. We've been able to add a few more people on staff. We've got a new economist on staff, so we can do modeling, kind of don't want to go in the guy's room because it's PhD economy. We have stuff on whiteboards and math stuff. It makes my head hurt. But now that we've done that, it actually might not be a bad thing to try to get. We wanted to go around and go to some individual meetings where there's actually the individual members there and just have some conversations about stuff. Because I want to be sure we're hearing some of that, because it's one thing to hear it from the lobbyists who represent them. It is another thing to hear it from individual members. So I think we need to probably do a little bit better job. I think we'd like to do a little bit better on that. But that's right now kind of popular. Do you have any suggestions? I'd love to hear.
My name's Evan. I was actually at the Westchester Boat meetings with Right to Work. When we heard that some of the unions were going to come down from out of town, which I knew was going to happen. But we have some trusty little bird who's looking out for the region itself. And, I spoke both times up the road. And, the first meeting was kind of rough. It was going to be rough.
I heard it was.
Bullying tactics, stuff like that. A lot of misnomers from a lot of what you would think would be credible sources. So I've got probably a few questions on that. The prevailing wage type of questions. Now, to me, that seems like, well, yeah, the prevailing wage might come down. But that's because you overstated what that really should be.
There's a whole host of issues with prevailing wage, actually. There's a lot of issues with prevailing wage. Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I think it's important for union members, not necessarily union leadership, but union members to understand right to work doesn't mean you have to union. In fact, in states, I think in Indiana, they actually have more people in unions than they had before they went right to work.
That's actually a really important question. Matt Bevins, that day of that first meeting was on, they had passed it.
Yeah. Oh, it was the same day? I didn't realize it was the same day.
Yeah, it was either the same day or right?
Yeah, it was very early January, yeah. I remember that.
So when I'm driving up to the meeting, I got the call, said, hey, you need to go. He's on Fox saying that I guess the top 5 right to work states are lean growers and union growth in your state. And so I didn't know that those type of figures came from, where they are.
Well, I think they're actually filed with the feds. You have to file like certain things. There's actually reports, I can't remember if it's DEA or BLS. There's actually filings where you can kind of see the actual union numbers that's filed at the federal level, and there's actually data that's pulled. And I think that's where it comes from. I'd
like a link to that if you had that.
Make sure I'll give you my card here. Make sure that you email me, and then what I'll do is, well, I've got cards in my bag. Don't let me leave without giving you a card. Because I'll pick that up. But I'm positive Indiana it was like that. I can't recall off my head about Michigan. That's possible too. I mean, think about it. It actually makes sense because what really that means is that the union, all they're doing is they have to spend more time actually dealing with the issues that the union members care about. The real problem with the union isn't, I mean, sometimes it's that they negotiate absurd situations and stuff like that, but it's also they spend all their money on politics. The biggest donors to politics are actually unions, not corporations, it's unions nationally, when you aggregate it all up. And so what this does is it says, you better be worrying about what you're doing for your individual members right now and not making a nice big glossy magazine for the teachers union that shows teachers for Hillary on the front of it, which I think actually happened with early days here in Ohio. And of course they're nonpartisan. So they're just having to represent their people better, and people get more satisfied and say, I'll sign up. I mean, right to work doesn't mean you don't sign up to the union. You just have a choice.
Well, that's the argument I gave him. I for the second, put a dollar bill up there, and I was like, and one gentleman who's very pro union, and I told him I'm not against unions. I get it, but I was like, should that was a $10 bill? I was like, this is what it's about. It's money. I was like, if you're putting out a good product, a good service, just like any market, people are going to pay for your service. And if you're not, people are not going to pay for your service. They're going to go elsewhere. And that's the point.
And the evidence, again, shows. In fact, I think we even have a piece we did on our website where it probably has in the footnotes the actual data and the exact data source for it. And I'll dig that up too. But yeah, I think that's a critical piece of information. It's not the death knell of unions. It should actually be arguably better for the individual members. It may hurt the bottom line of some of the boxes, but it doesn't hurt the rank of file people. And when you hear all this crap about, right to work for less, most of the states that are right to work historically were for the South and the West. Well, they had a lower baseline. we look at the actual growth rates of income, they actually have pretty high, they have, in many cases, most cases, they have faster income growth than we do in states like Ohio. The challenge is that they started from a really baseline. I mean, the South has had a lot of challenges, and it's certainly growing like gangbusters these days, but that hasn't always been the case in the South. And so what you're talking about is you're not taking into account. In fact, there's been, we have a report on right to work, and one of the footnotes in the report has got another study that was done when they held the factors accountable for their initial baselines. They were able to figure out what the growth rates were. And so if you take a look at that, again, you'll see it's faster growth. And if you look at the states that are right to work, there's some exceptions. There's a few exceptions, but overall, most of the job growth in America is coming in states that are right to work states. And they're growing much, much faster, probably about 2.5 to 3 times as fast in terms of private sector job growth as the states that are. And you know, I think that the answer is businesses obviously like to know what the environment is. But again, even though it means that they're willing to make investments that way, but it's still, people are still signing up and doing okay.
Okay,
That
we
answer
have
your
time.
question?
Oh, I'm sorry, Greg, I thought you were done.
Oh, sorry. No.
We have time just for one more question.
Hi, my name's John. Actually, did you teach this same kind of thing, Empower You session in like 2011 or 12?
Possibly. Well, I've done a couple of these.
Deer Library, Right to Work?
It might have been. It's
Yeah.
conceivable.
Oh, yeah,
I was actually going to do a little bit more right to work when I initially was going to do this, but then I realized there's so much more than just that issue that's worth
Right.
talking about. That's why I kind of expanded. But it's very possible I did because I've done it. I need it 2 or 3 times. I know at least twice, probably 3. Okay.
all right.
I know one of them was with Dusty Rhodes. I remember that one because that was the one where I was saying it was good to cut the local government.
Okay, my real question was that Ohioans Workplace Freedom was gathering petition signatures for that to get it on the ballot. Do you know what's?
Yeah, technically,
becoming
there
that.
may still be some people doing that. But I mean, yeah, technically you can still gather, you can submit them even if they're 5 years old. Now they still have to be valid signatures, so somebody who died or something like that, then you lose all those signatures. There was a grassroots group for a lot of reasons. Some of it was the governor wasn't for it and put the kibosh on fundraising. I mean, here's the deal. Hard time getting the signatures. I mean, the reason unions to get signatures to stop ballot issues is because they can flip a switch and increase the dues and do it. Simplify, for example, yeah. A special assessment. Yep. Yep. And so with the business, you know, and so whenever you have a ballot issue that's backed by somebody has to put the money on it. And the problem is that the people who would have put money into that issue are pretty much told don't do it. And so there's been a real handicap. So what this has been is a pure grassroots effort and a well-meaning and a good one. People pride in yeoman's work, but I don't think they're anywhere near as many people needed. Yeah, those are valid. Yeah. Oh yeah. Because a lot of them are going to be you know, not right, or somebody printed their name instead of signing it, and that means that it's thrown out. Those kind of things. Yeah, I don't envision that that's really. I mean, I've seen a few people at a couple of events in there still doing it. I mean, God bless them. I think it's a nice thing to do, but I don't think that's going to be I don't think that's probably going to make it. You know, because if you submitted it now, I have no idea what your ballot validity rate is, but I bet you it ain't going to be that high. You're going to lose a lot.
Well, I think we should wrap it up now, and let's give him a round of applause. It was great. You did a great job, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I hope everyone takes a calendar with you when you leave, and we hope to see you again. Thank you.